Here is a paradox at the heart of modern Britain. At the very moment its government was banning Islamist groups as terrorists, it was also fighting over whether to make criticizing Islam a kind of offense. One hand cracking down on Islamism, the other drafting a definition of Islamophobia. And underneath it all sits a fact almost nobody states correctly. The ideology Britain fears most makes up barely 1/10 of the cases flagged to its de-radicalization program, yet 3/4 of the actual terror threat. To understand what the UK really did, you have to separate the law from the myth, the threat from the 4 million ordinary Muslims who have nothing to do with it. So let's do exactly that. By the end of this video, you'll understand the single biggest move Britain made against Islamism, the quiet machine of laws it built around that move, the honest numbers that almost every headline gets wrong, and the strange contradiction sitting at the center of it all. But none of it makes sense until we get one thing straight, the thing that, if you blur it, turns this entire story into propaganda. There are 3 words that get thrown around as if they mean the same thing. They do not. The first is Islam, a religion. In England and Wales, around 3.9 million people, 6.5% of the population, told the 2021 census they were Muslim. They are teachers, doctors, bus drivers, shopkeepers, your neighbors. The overwhelming majority have no political project of any kind. That is Islam. The second word is Islamism. This is not a religion. It is a political ideology held by a small minority that wants to reorder the state and society around one hard interpretation of Islamic law. Britain's own counter-extremism experts describe it as a supremacist, us versus them worldview. It is defined not by how devout someone is, but by a political goal. Most Muslims are not Islamists. That is the crucial line. And the third is Islamist terrorism. The violent fringe of that already small minority, the people willing to kill for the ideology. Only a fraction even of Islamists ever go near it. Islam contains Islamism, which contains Islamist terrorism. But the second and third are tiny slivers of the first. Hold on to that, because every number and every law in this story only means what it should if you keep those 3 apart.
Britain's government has spent years trying to act against the second and third without punishing the first, and the argument over whether it succeeded is the argument we're about to have. Now, the biggest single move. In January 2024, Britain did something it had avoided for over 2 decades. There was a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir. It had been in Britain since the 1990s. It held conferences, ran stalls at universities, marched in the streets, and made no secret of its aim: the creation of a global caliphate, a single Islamic state ruled by its version of Islamic law. For years, it operated completely legally. Successive governments had looked at banning it. Tony Blair promised to and didn't, and every time they backed away, because Hizb ut-Tahrir did something clever. It stayed, by its own account, non-violent. It didn't plant bombs, it dealt in words and ideas.
And in a country that prizes free speech, banning a group for its ideas felt like a line no government wanted to cross. Then, on the 19th of January 2024, the government crossed it. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, prescribed Hizb ut-Tahrir as a terrorist organization. Overnight, being a member became a crime. So did inviting support for it, or even displaying its logo. The penalties run up to 14 years in prison. Britain's 80th banned terrorist group was not banned for an attack. It was banned, in large part, for what it said, including material on its website celebrating the Hamas assault of the 7th of October 2023. Understand how unusual that is. Most proscribed organizations are armed groups. Hizb ut-Tahrir was proscribed on the grounds that it promotes and encourages terrorism. The power exists in the Terrorism Act, but applying it to a group with no bombing campaign was, legal scholars noted, genuinely novel. To the government, this was closing a loophole. An organization glorifying mass murder should not hide behind the fact that it never pulled a trigger itself. To its critics, it was the state banning an idea, using terrorism law against speech, and setting a precedent that could one day reach further. Both of those things are true at once, and that tension never leaves this story. So why did Britain finally cross the line it had avoided for 20 years? Part of the answer is the 7th of October and the months that followed.
As war erupted in Gaza, Britain's streets filled with the largest protests in a generation, and within them, a harder edge, celebration of the attacks, and groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir suddenly very visible, very loud. The mood in Westminster shifted. But the deeper answer came a year earlier, in a document most people never read. In February 2023, an independent review of Britain's flagship anti-radicalisation programme, led by William Shawcross, landed on the government's desk. Its verdict was blunt. The programme had lost focus. It had drifted toward the far right and toward vague safeguarding, while underweighting the thing that, in Shawcross's words, had been the most lethal threat of the last 20 years, Islamism. The government accepted all 34 of its recommendations the same day. The machine was about to be pointed deliberately back at political Islam. Hizb ut-Tahrir was the loudest sign of that turn. But it was not the only one, because the ban was one piece of something larger, a whole architecture of measures assembled law by law that few people noticed being built. Start with Hamas. Britain had banned its military wing back in 2001. In 2021, it went further and prescribed the entire organization, political wing included, declaring the distinction between the two artificial. By the time October 2023 came, supporting Hamas in Britain was already a crime. Then, in March 2024, the government tried to draw a wider net. The Communities Secretary, Michael Gove, unveiled a new official definition of extremism, a way to identify groups that promote hatred or intolerance and seek to undermine Britain's democracy, so the state could cut them off from public money and ministers. He signalled that several organisations would be assessed against it, including Islamist-linked groups. It was fiercely attacked by the named groups who denied the label and by free speech campaigners who called it a dangerous precedent. And here honesty matters. That definition was never a law, it was guidance. No group was ever formally designated under it. And when a new Labour government arrived that summer, the whole exercise was quietly shelved. A move announced with fanfare that largely evaporated. Then, the Muslim Brotherhood. Back in 2015, David Cameron had commissioned a review that concluded aspects of the Brotherhood's ideology ran contrary to British values and could be a possible indicator of extremism. But it stopped short of a ban, and no ban came. The question returned in late 2025, when Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the Brotherhood was under very close review. But review is not prescription. As of today, the Muslim Brotherhood is not banned in Britain. Anyone who tells you it is wrong. And then, most recently, Iran.
In July 2026, Britain moved against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the armed heart of the Iranian state and a sponsor of Islamist militancy across the region. But here you have to be precise, because almost everyone gets this wrong. The IRGC was not prescribed as a terrorist organization. It was designated under a brand new law, the National Security Act, dealing with state threats, a separate regime built for hostile foreign states rather than terror groups. Iran was placed on the enhanced tier of a new foreign influence register, the first country ever listed there. Supporting a designated body can bring 14 years. Sabotage, life. It was one of Britain's toughest moves against Iran ever. But it was a state threat action, not a terrorism ban. Say Britain banned the IRGC as terrorists, and you've already lost the plot. Line them up: Hamas, Hizb ut-Tahrir, the extremism definition, the Brotherhood review, the IRGC. Piece by piece, Britain had assembled one of the most aggressive counter-Islamism toolkits in the Western world. And at the center of it sat the machine Shawcross had criticized, a program called Prevent. This is where the honest numbers live, and where the myth-making is worst. Prevent is the part of Britain's counter-terror strategy that operates before any crime is committed. Teachers, doctors, police can refer someone they fear is being radicalized. A panel decides whether to offer them support. In the year to March 2025, referrals hit a record, 8,778 of them. Now watch the breakdown, because this is the fact almost every headline gets wrong. Of all those referrals, Islamist extremism made up just 10%. Extreme right-wing concerns were twice that.
And the single largest category, more than half, was people with no discernible ideology at all. Troubled, often young, often online, drawn to violence without a cause. 10%. If you stop there, you'd conclude Islamism was a minor issue. But now look at the other end of the pipeline. Not who gets referred, but who actually ends up dangerous. Among those in prison in Britain for terrorism, around 60% are Islamist. And the head of MI5 has said, year after year, that roughly 75% of his service's counter-terror caseload is Islamist. 3/4. That is the paradox at the core of this whole story. Islamism is a small slice of the people flagged for concern, but the large majority of the people who become a genuine terrorist threat. 1/10 of the referrals, 3/4 of the danger. That mismatch is exactly what Shawcross meant when he said Prevent had lost its aim, and exactly why Britain moved to refocus it. It is also why you must never, ever put that 75% figure next to the number of British Muslims and imply a connection. 75% of a caseload of a few thousand suspects is a rounding error against a population of 4 million. The threat is real, and it is concentrated, and it is still the work of a vanishing fraction of a faith. But just as Britain was sharpening its focus on Islamism, something happened that scrambled the entire picture. On the 29th of July 2024, in the town of Southport, a 17-year-old named Axel Rudakubana walked into a children's dance class and murdered 3 little girls. It was one of the most horrific attacks in modern British history, and it was not terrorism. Ruta Cubana had no ideology, not Islamist, not far-right, nothing coherent.
He was obsessed with violence itself. He had been referred to Prevent 3 separate times, and 3 times his case was closed because he didn't fit any ideological box. The deadliest attack on British children in years slipped straight through a system built to catch ideologies, because this killer didn't have one. Southport detonated the debate. If the worst attacker in years had no ideology at all, was Britain even looking in the right place? The government ordered a rapid review of extremism itself. It overhauled Prevent, appointed a new independent commissioner, and lowered the thresholds so that a fascination with extreme violence, with no ideology attached, could now be treated as seriously as any belief. So Britain ended up doing 2 things at once: refocusing on Islamism, the concentrated threat, while also broadening its gaze beyond ideology entirely to catch the next Ruta Cubana. Both moves at the same time pulling in different directions. And then comes the contradiction that gives this story its strangest twist: the other hand of the state. At the very same time the government was banning Islamist groups and hardening its language on extremism, it was also trying to write an official definition of Islamophobia. In early 2025, it set up a working group chaired by a former Attorney General to do exactly that. And it walked straight into a wall of opposition. Not from the far right, but from secularists, free speech campaigners, academics, and dozens of members of the House of Lords. Their warning was sharp. Define Islamophobia too broadly, and you risk shielding not just Muslims from hatred, which everyone supports, but Islam itself, and even Islamism, from criticism. You could end up policing the very speech that Britain's counter-Islamism laws depend on. Think about how odd that is. One arm of the government was prescribing a group partly for its ideas, while another was being warned that its new definition might make criticizing those same ideas unsafe. And in the end, the free speech pressure told. When the government finally acted in 2026, it did not adopt a definition of Islamophobia at all. It adopted a narrower one: anti-Muslim hostility, and pointedly dropped the word Islamophobia. Britain's largest Muslim umbrella body refused to endorse it, calling it watered down. The contradiction didn't resolve. It just settled uneasily in the middle. Which brings us to the part of this story that the crackdown headlines leave out entirely: the 4 million. Because every one of these measures lands on a community, most of which is doing nothing wrong. And the data on how that community is treated is its own kind of alarming. In the year to March 2024, religious hate crime in England and Wales hit a record high, and Muslims were the single most targeted group. Nearly 4,000 offences, 38% of the total. The same period saw anti-Jewish hate crime more than double after the 7th of October. Britain, in other words, was becoming a more hostile place for its religious minorities at exactly the moment it was reaching for tougher laws. And this is where the critics, Muslim organizations, civil liberties groups, many academics, make their case. They argue that programs like Prevent and the drumbeat of extremism announcements treat ordinary Muslims as a suspect community, that they blur the line between Islam and Islamism that we drew so carefully at the start, and that they push a whole population to feel watched for the crimes of a tiny few. The government answers that it targets ideology, not faith, and that most of those it helps through Prevent are not Muslim at all. Both of these are honest positions. Both can be argued from the facts. What cannot be argued from the facts are the myths. and this story is buried under them. So let's kill a few. Britain is not under Sharia law. No religious code overrides British courts, and the Sharia councils that exist handle religious matters like faith divorces and have no legal power whatsoever. There are no Muslim no-go zones. The famous claim that Birmingham was one was so false, the broadcaster who said it apologized on air, and the Prime Minister called him an idiot. Britain is not about to become majority Muslim. Even the highest serious projection puts the Muslim share at around 1 in 6 by 2050, not 1 in 2. And there are not 18 million Muslims in Britain or anything close. The real figure is under 4 million.
The true story here is dramatic enough. It does not need the lies, and the lies only make it harder to see. So step back, and you find two Britons looking at the same events and reaching opposite conclusions. The first Briton says, "At last, for 20 years, the most lethal terror threat in the country was Islamist, and the state tiptoed around it, too nervous to ban a group for glorifying murder, too distracted to keep its own programs aimed at the real danger. Banning Hizb ut-Tahrir, refocusing Prevent, moving on Iran. This is a democracy finally defending itself, through law and through parliament, against a genuine, concentrated, ideological threat." The second Briton says, "Be careful what you are building. A group banned for what it said, not what it did. A definition of extremism vague enough to frighten lawful critics into silence."
A whole community watched, referred, and stigmatized for the actions of a fraction of a fraction. And a record tide of hatred washing over ordinary Muslims, while the state debates how, or whether, to even name it. Both of these Britons are real, and the most revealing thing of all is that the government itself is caught between them, banning Islamist groups with one hand, while agonizing over a definition that might protect their ideas from criticism with the other. That is not a country that has made up its mind. That is a country arguing with itself in real time over the hardest question a free society can face. How do you fight an ideology without turning on a faith? Britain has made its biggest move against Islamism, a series of them actually, quiet and legal and far-reaching.
Whether history remembers them as overdue courage or as the slow blurring of the line between fighting an idea and policing a people is not yet written. It depends on where the next line is drawn and who draws it. And because Britain so often goes first among the democracies of the West, the rest of them are watching very closely to see which way it finally falls.